and welcome to the BPD Bunch. We have a panel of people who are in functional recovery from borderline personality disorder, and each week a few of us get together to discuss the ups and downs of our BPD journeys to give you hope and direction for your own. I'm your host, Xannie, and today I am here with Georgette, Mo, Madhurima, and Jay. Where in the world is everyone coming from?
I'm coming from New Jersey in the United States.
Central Ohio in the United States.
Kolkata, India.
And I'm coming from Calgary in Canada.
Today we want to explore the concept of trusting yourself, which can be a challenge whether you have BPD or not. But if you do have BPD, you may have had experiences where intense emotions clouded your judgment. Maybe you've had experiences where other people dismissed your emotions, telling you that you were overreacting or making a big deal out of nothing. These types of situations can leave you feeling uncertain about what an appropriate reaction should be or what you should be doing, what makes sense for a situation. So today we are going to unpack that, and hopefully by the end you will have some ideas on how to trust yourself better. So can everyone share some specific experiences or situations from your life that have had a significant impact on your ability to trust yourself?
For me, the question of trusting myself came much later into my life when I actually started my recovery, because before that, I was more like the person who was a doormat to other people. I had no opinions of my own. Most of my life has been dictated by opinions that were validated by other people, either my parents or my friends. And if they thought what I was doing was right, then it was the right thing to do. And if they did not approve of it, then, well, that idea has to get crumpled up and be thrown in the trash can. When I started my recovery, I actually learned the wild, wild thought that this is my life and I have autonomy over it. And I get to decide what I want to do with it and how I want to live it and which decisions to make. Then and there began my sudden jump from being a doormat to being an impulsive decision maker. It was such a wild idea to me that I can do what I want, that I kind of became unhinged about doing whatever I could do. And I became the exact person that would do things and then deal the consequences of it later. Eventually, with time, what would happen is that these two sides of me would clash in my mind so hard, and it would make trusting myself way harder. Like, do I trust the version of me that has been so docile, or do I trust the person who has been impulsive, made her own decisions, but has landed herself in almost always a negative situation?
I didn't used to worry about trusting my own instinct at first. When I was in the worst of my BPD, I would just do whatever felt good, and then I would pay the consequence later. And then once I realized that I wanted to feel better emotionally, I didn't trust myself, and I struggled with it a lot. So I would still choose to be friends or in a relationship with people who weren't so great for me. There's one very specific event. I was in my early 20s and I was seeing a guy who, he was in the military. And so he was like 3 or 4 states away. And it was the only time that I was going to be able to see him. And so I said, I want to fly out to see you for the weekend, you know? And I could tell that he wasn't wanting that to happen at all. I didn't have the money for it. I had already made plans with my friends that weekend, but I couldn't bear the thought of not seeing him. So anyway, I end up buying these super expensive tickets, and my mom's driving me to the airport, and I'm just bawling my eyes out because deep down I knew this is not the right thing to do. And I kept thinking, like, just don't go. Like, even though I've already spent the money, don't go. You're going to get hurt. So I go, and that weekend was a disaster. We ended up just fighting the whole time, not having fun. So when I came back home, it just clicked. I'm like, you know, if I would have just stayed home, I'd have a lot more money and I would have been able to hang out with my friends, and it just would have been better. We eventually broke up.
Kind of like the fight between your gut almost and your like emotional influence of the moment.
Yeah. because I was so impulsive in the beginning. And if it felt good, I would do it, even if I knew it wasn't a great choice.
I can totally relate to what you're saying about just like acting on your feelings, because I definitely used to do the same thing. I don't know exactly where I got this idea from, but I used to really have almost like this sense of false confidence. I would kind of own all the stuff that I did, but not in a taking accountability kind of way. It was like, this is me, suck it. People would say things to me like, do something even though you don't feel like it. And that seemed like a bananas foreign concept to me. I was like, what do you mean? I am my emotions. I would often end up with negative consequences. And I think one of the things that really got me in trouble was what I would call like a righteous anger, where I would feel like I was doing something that was balancing the scales, like someone was wrong, and so therefore they deserve this reaction from me. The problem was that oftentimes what I thought they had done wrong either had not happened or was greatly exaggerated in my mind. That made it very difficult for me to trust, like, when am I holding boundaries with people and when am I just being an asshole? I couldn't really tell the difference. And it didn't help that people were often telling me, you're making a big deal out of nothing, which sometimes I probably was having an exaggerated reaction, or like the way that I was expressing my reaction was disproportionate to the situation. But other times, most likely, other people just felt called out and didn't want to have to deal with it. But I really struggled to be able to tell the difference. And definitely over the course of my early recovery, I kind of switched from this is me, suck it, to, well, I'm just going to be a doormat. And if I never make anybody upset or stand up for anything ever, then I never have to worry about it. I just stopped trusting myself altogether and was like, I'm going to let other people dictate what is right because obviously I don't know.
I had this bravado of like, oh no, I make good decisions. I'm a snap decision maker. Like, I just go with my gut. My gut's always right. And it wasn't until I entered into a state of recovery that I could see that, I don't know that going with my gut is always right 100% of the time. I think sometimes going with my gut was like, I was listening a little bit to my inner voice, that I was making the right decision, but it was the way I went about acting on that decision that was not the best way to do it. Like, I was angry one time with my dad, so I took a cup that I made in pottery class and took it and just smashed it outside on our walkway. I don't think that was the right way to show it, but I completely trusted that that was the right way. Like, somebody needed to see that I was really mad and to take me seriously. At least for me, before I was diagnosed and in recovery, I just felt like I could totally trust myself. And it wasn't until after entering recovery that I was like, I don't really know that I necessarily was carrying these things through the right way, or a way that aligned with like my values.
So in my story, I guess like it's always been very heavily connected to being invalidated and other people attempting to control in some way how I act. Not really being about me doing what's right or wrong. It's more been about what other people can or can't deal with and what's comfortable to them. My parents were always really uncomfortable with the fact that I was gay for a long time. And it wasn't until I turned 18 that I sat down with my mum and dad and I was like, how many more years do you want to take off of my life while you try to figure out being comfortable with this? I can't date, I can't do anything because it's not cool to you. To be fair, my parents would never have stopped me dating somebody, but I couldn't cope with how side-eyed they were about the whole thing and the dynamics that it created in the house and all of that. But I didn't trust that I was doing the right thing by dating, and for such a long time that I actively avoided it, even though it made me extremely sad. And in other situations, particularly at school, I was often discouraged from believing that I was doing work in the right way or behaving in the right way, when I think I often was. And going back through this in therapy, I was usually behaving appropriately, but the way that I was being pushed down almost evoked like worse reactions from me me exploding to be seen, I suppose, because what was really me was being suppressed. So it was like I had to fight back and react 10 times as hard just to be recognized in a way.
In the biopsychosocial theory for developing BPD, the whole sort of idea is that we're born more emotionally sensitive, and then certain environmental factors combined end up to creating BPD. And sometimes that's like significant trauma, and sometimes that's just a little bit of invalidation. And I think what's interesting about those of us like that are born on the really high end of emotional sensitivity is that it really doesn't take much. And that's not to say like, oh, it's always the other person's fault. There's one instance that really stands out to me that had a significant impact on my ability to trust myself and also think it was okay to reach out for help. And that was like a month into a breakup. I was just heartbroken. I was on the floor crying like every day. This girl who wanted to date me said, it's been a month. How are you not over it already? And even in that moment, I knew that came from a place of she wanted to start a relationship with me and she wanted me to be moved on from that. And it wasn't really about whether or not it was appropriate for me to still be upset that far in. But that moment burned into my mind. And after that, it's like if it's been more than a few days of me being upset about something, I hear her voice in my head. Like, oh, it's been a few days. Like, you really should stop calling people to bother them about it now because, there's something wrong with you. That has made it hard for me to know, is it okay for me to still be upset about something like X number of days or weeks after it happened? And it's amazing because it was just one thing. And I rationally understand the motivation too. And it still had such a huge effect on how I acted years afterwards.
I was married like a couple days before my 22nd birthday. And I realized I spent most of my adult life before diagnosis, all of my adult life really before diagnosis, in a relationship in which I never really had to trust myself because I had a partner who I could trust and who I could kind of use to, and not intentionally like use in a bad way, but like I just didn't feel like I could just check with him, right? I could trust him to tell me if something was a good idea, a bad idea. So I didn't have a lot of situations throughout my adult life in which I had to rely on myself. And it was after, the relationship ended, I got divorced. And now I'm in a situation where I have to like trust myself a lot more. And I've had to work on figuring out how to do that.
Something that I think is really difficult in this whole process is, in a way, therapy encourages us to question ourselves, right? Which is good, but at the same time can be really complicated because it can get you to a point where, or at least this has been my case, it can get me to a point where I'm like, this is exhausting. I'm just constantly don't know whether I'm doing the right thing, the wrong thing. I don't know, and I'm tired. It's become a real present situation in school, to be honest, in academic relationships, because professors always hold a specific level of power over you as a student. And so sometimes my mind is always saying to me, oh, I should hear what they're saying and I should trust what they're saying because they're the prof and they know better. Sometimes that's not always the case, actually. Sometimes they're coming at things from their own slant and they're just being a person and saying what they think. There was one situation, a prof sort of, tossed a book at me and was like, go away and read this and talk to me about it in a few days. And I beat myself up for the whole week because I could not figure out what it was that they wanted me to take away from this. I was angry because this was right at the beginning of my recovery journey, and I was really struggling to get my mind into states where I could work because I was still feeling too much all the time and almost like feeling like I was constantly on the edge of a crisis. And I remember asking, can you give me some guiding questions or whatever? And the person almost called me stupid, if for asking, to my face, and was like, no, I don't have time for this. And for such a long time, I really struggled to trust whether or not I was valid for asking for that, valid for feeling hurt by the person not wanting to give those, or if it was genuine and fair that that person could not have the time for that. Ultimately, came to the conclusion that it's not fair. This is what a prof is supposed to do. This is a huge text, and it's not an uncommon thing to ask for. But that realization only really came like within a year of that happening. It took me a really long time to trust that I was perceiving that appropriately 9 times out of 10, because I was being constantly told that, every time I felt something or felt a certain way about, especially somebody in a position of power, like a teacher, that I was wrong inherently, because they're here and I'm here. So
it's really interesting what you said, because you're describing a situation in which there's a power dynamic. And I noticed that. So I'm a nurse educator, and I've always worked in this institution that's a teaching institution. And there's power dynamics in the medical field. You have doctors give orders that nurses carry through. Like it's a very hierarchical structure, sort of like education. I remember when I first started, I was a new nurse, and a doctor would tell me something, and I just was like, oh, well, they're the doctor, so they know, right? And it took a little while of working there and gaining confidence in my own practice to learn that, like, oh, wait a minute, just because they're the doctor doesn't mean that I shouldn't question them, or that I don't have the power or like the wherewithal to question them. Just because they're the person higher up in the hierarchy doesn't mean that they necessarily know better. In my personal life, with having like a favorite person who was my ex-husband, that was a position of power too. I held that person in a position where they know better than me. And so I just completely relied on them. And then it becomes hard to question, because you think this person is like, well, this person just knows. This person is the boss. This person is the person who's the professor. So it sows more kind of self-doubt.
Are there any specific moments or milestones in your recovery where you realized you were starting to trust yourself more, and what led to those breakthroughs?
5 years ago, I still struggled with trusting my own instincts. And so I would talk to either my husband or like one of my friends who maybe weren't as emotional as me. And I would get their perspective on if my feelings or reactions to a situation that I was struggling with was reasonable or expected, or if I was maybe just being a little bit too critical or too emotional about what I should do. And so I would get a more rational person's perspective on it. And that made me more confident in deciding how I should handle whatever challenge I was dealing with. And so it got me in the habit of being able to analyze situations from a more rational mind, as well as my own emotional driven mind. And so I don't have to do that as much anymore. I don't need to ask for a trusted person's perspective as much. Sometimes I do. But usually I'm able to judge a situation, and I'm also able to be rational about it. But, I also realize that depending on how distressing this problem is, sometimes it takes me a day or two to just let my emotions run the course, and I feel however I feel about it. And then after my emotions have calmed down a little bit, I'm able to be more rational about what's going on, and I can make a better decision on how to handle it.
This has actually come very recently for me. So I'm now at a point where anytime something happens, I don't react immediately. I just step back, take time, think. And I think that's really integral to me having learned to kind of trust my responses more, because I'm like, no, I've pondered this. I've thought about all possible avenues, and this is my answer. And I stand kind of really firm on that. So if a situation occurs and I have a conversation with somebody about it, I can be much more assertive in those conversations while still being respectful of different takes, because I can be like, no, this is not emotional. This is not me being excessively rational either. I've taken a minute and put those two things together and really thought about, okay, how do I feel about this? So I think that for me is a milestone, but I think that's been actively encouraged. I'm fortunate, I suppose, through my therapeutic process, because I have a therapist who I can argue with and I can say, I don't understand this. And we talk about it and we thrash it out. And it's not just immediately, well, this is what the mantra is, so you must do it or not do it. So I think it's been something I've been working on for the past couple of years, and it's taken a long time to get to this point.
For me, like, the breakthrough would be my judgment when it comes to trusting other people. Recently, like maybe a year back, I made a lot of new friends, and usually what the old me would have done is overshare and trust, and then get hurt when the feeling was not reciprocated or when I didn't feel wanted or needed enough. But what I could see in myself this time is that I was very cautious with how I approached people. And I was very cautious of how much I was letting them in. And even though there were so many chances of impulsive decisions, I made the choice to wait out and see who lasts. And I'm glad of that, because now the people who are in my life, I'm at least like very sure-footed of them. And those who are not, well, I can say that I tried, but it was never going to work out anyway. So this is one part of my life where I trusted my own judgment. I went with my gut and I rationalized it, and it was a breakthrough moment.
I think for me, it's not a specific moment as much as it is a specific realization that like sort of happened over time, which is that there are instances in which I can trust myself and instances in which I probably shouldn't, because there are times when I'm so emotionally dysregulated that I'm probably not in a state where I can make a decision that is in line with my values. I've thought about things in very black or white terms. It's like I'm either trusting myself or I'm not trusting myself. Like it's all on me or it's all on someone else. And I think just realizing that life is not clear cut, and trust, even self-trust, is not always going to be accurate. You know, I think we get into this place where if there's any doubt that we have about ourselves, it's like, oh, this is a sign that I'm still disordered somehow. I actually think that for me, having some amount of self-doubt, as long as it doesn't devolve into harsh self-criticism, is very healthy. And so I would say I don't always have to trust myself, because I'm often going to make mistakes, and that's okay. So it's more about what are the decisions that I can live with, because for me, so much of the time it's like, what is right and what is wrong? Like, what's the right reaction to have? And, you know, sometimes I'll have a reaction and someone will say, well, you know, like, that's unusual or that's not normal. And I'm like, so what? You know, as long as I'm not hurting anyone else or myself, it's like, so what?
Learning to give myself grace in recovery was very helpful. It sounds like what you're describing, like that black and white thinking and that feeling that, well, if I'm not right, I'm wrong. It's paralyzing. Because for me, I don't ever want to be wrong, because being wrong makes me a bad person. And so changing that way of thinking took the pressure off, because I realized, like, I don't have to be right all the time. I can make a mistake and it doesn't make me this awful, terrible person. It just makes me a person. I feel like it gives you the space to start trusting yourself, because you're dropping that, you know, well, if I make the wrong decision, I'm terrible.
Yeah.
So it gives you permission to make a mistake, which makes it feel safer to take an action.
Sometimes I think we base whether or not we were right to do something on the outcome of a situation. Like, did it go the way I wanted it to? And sometimes we're not actually in control. A lot of times we're not really in control. Like, we influence a situation, but we don't have that much control. So one of the things that helps me have more confidence in myself is, regardless of the outcome, how do I feel about this decision? Like, is this in line with my values? Is this in line with the person that I want to be seen as, regardless of whether or not it works? For example, I have really struggled with lashing out in anger at people, and I really try not to engage in loud displays of aggression unless absolutely necessary, because I don't want to be an angry person. I don't want to be someone who tries to get what they want through aggression. That's not what I want to be known for. That helps me to make a decision to, for example, be calmer in an interaction, regardless of whether I actually achieve my goals or not. If I can be happy with how I behaved, if I can look back on it and say, I did the best I could, I am happy with the person that I was in that interaction, then I can trust that I did the right thing. How do you strike a balance between seeking support from others and relying on yourself?
I think it's important to talk to someone who knows you well, or someone who's been through a similar situation, and to get their perspective. After you hear that perspective, you're still ultimately making your own decisions. The balance for me is just knowing that I'm making a well-informed decision and I have another opinion to back up the decision that I'm making for myself.
So I know a couple of people in my life who I know have my best interest at heart, who I feel like has a history of making good decisions for themselves in their own lives, and who know me well enough to weigh in and give an opinion. So I find that I will turn to those people when I want a little input on a decision that I've made. So I can go to them and say, this is the situation. This is what I'm thinking of doing. What are your thoughts on that? And I can then take what they say and think about it and see like, okay, well, this is what they've said. They are not me. They are not living with the decisions that I may make. So like I can take those opinions into consideration while still realizing that the decision I make is mine. It's my life. I'm living it. So I need to make sure that I'm confident in that for myself.
I come to this very fine line between making the decision for myself and asking of others' opinions on my decision versus asking the other person to make a decision for me. I think I used to do the latter more often in the past. So now what I have learned is that it's about the delicate balance. Now I know I have certain people in my life who I trust with these decisions, and I would go and I would tell them that this is what I think and this is what I think I should do. And I would ask them of what they think about it. And I think the most important part is where I'm able to balance both of our opinion. Like, okay, if this person is offering something that is like, polar opposite than my solution, then I must be wrong or that person must be wrong. I just need to get to a middle ground where both of us can be right and two things can be right at the same time. So it's a very delicate balance, and I'm not always successful, but I try to keep it in mind that two things can be true, and I have to keep a really open mind when I'm trying to reach out to somebody to help me with the decision.
Yeah, I think this is a really complex dynamic, especially because I mean, speaking for myself, but I think a lot of people with BPD are shamed into thinking that they're too much and overbearing for everyone else and constantly relying on them for things. So it can be really hard for us in therapy processes to know, or recovery journeys, I should say, rather, to know. I know I've had moments I felt like, well, if I'm not doing this all on my own, then I have not achieved recovery. I'm not, but that's just fundamentally wrong. I think at the moment, I tend to go and talk to my therapist about things because she's it's not really because she's my DBT therapist and she's the voice of reason and a clinician. It's because she knows really enough about me to help me in these kinds of moments. And having moved between 3 countries, there aren't a lot of people that I'm connected to now who have known me for a considerable amount of time that I trust or connect with to the extent that I would go to them for that kind of information. Maybe 2 people, and I do still talk to other people that I trust. But I think one thing that I guess I will leave it with is like, I personally don't think it's reliance upon anyone to ask for perspectives. You're not getting them to fix it for you. If they've allowed you to feel comfortable sharing, you feel comfortable sharing, they've asked, actively engaged you in that conversation, then, you know, it's not reliance. You just would like perspective.
I asked my therapist once, I was like, how do you develop an intuition? And her answer was basically like trial and error. You know, it's not something that you just, oh, here are the body sensations or here are the things, and then you just know, because the context of a situation makes a big difference. Like, you can't say, oh, every time you feel this way, it means this, because there are a lot of other inputs. All right, well, thank you everyone so much for watching. I hope you got a nugget of wisdom to take with you on your journey. We'll be back on Friday for a little continuation of this topic, and then we'll be back again next week for a brand new topic. So come back for that. Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications so that you do not miss a single update. And we will see you then.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.